There are roving microphones which we will get to you ASAP. First question.
Thank you very much for your talk. I've just got two questions, or one question really. The issue seems to be like, is Russia a problem for the West? But is it more the case that maybe the West is more a problem for Russia? In September of 2015, there was a meeting in Moscow of the Dialogue of Nations, the right to self-determination and the construction of a multipolar world. And the Russians are arguing against what they deem the unipolar world of American hegemony or dominance, stemming from the American concept of a new world order, which Russia has been progressively excluded from. Early on in the peace post-1991, Russia attempted to join NATO. That was being offered, and that was subsequently dropped. And America has pursued unilateral actions to isolate Russia, to putting armaments on Russia's border, for instance. So all these things have led to Russia reacting in ways that are perhaps understandable. And one quote from that speech, from that meeting, America is a Russian representative said, America is a Leviathan state, a huge hooligan or policeman intent on executing the will of global mega corporations. And
you're going to have to finish the question.
So, do you think that's a legitimate response to Russia's feelings of isolation? And especially when you dovetail that with Vladimir Putin's statement that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, which has led to 25 million Russians living outside of the Russian Federation.
There's no way I can begin to address everything in your question, but I mean, from the perspective of someone who studies international relations and the dynamics of, especially of great powers that lead to very destructive great power war, I think, and in this sense, I think what I will say is sort of maybe consistent with a lot of what Graeme said. There's this old idea that I think is still a very powerful idea of the security dilemma in international politics, and removing sort of the blame about right and wrong. It's many people have noticed that when one state tries to increase its own security, it necessarily, or almost necessarily, is perceived or is actually results in a reduction of another state's security. So there's a real dilemma in the, if Russia takes Crimea, that means that many states like Ukraine feel less secure, but also the Baltic states, Poland, they, really clamor for some extra security, and the U.S. is more than happy to provide it because it's worried about actually what if Russia takes the Baltic states, which would decrease U.S. security. At least they perceive it that way. So then they put their forces, as Graeme mentioned, right up against Russia's border. The U.S. feels more secure. The Lithuanians feel more secure, but the Russians are more worried, and this is the source of a spiral. So, it's easy to say one side is right or wrong, but for me, the bigger picture is, how do we intervene to stop these spirals from happening and to ameliorate this security dilemma, which, regardless of what's happening between Russia and the U.S. now, has, I think, always been a factor in international politics, and we actually have some ways to get around it.
Yeah, look, I think you'd understand from what I said that basically I think a lot of what you say is right. It's certainly from the Russian perspective, the West and the Americans have been a problem, and it started before the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, there is some disagreement about what happened at this stage, but Gorbachev claimed that he was given an undertaking that if he allowed East Germany to integrate with West Germany, that NATO would not extend past the East German border. The Americans now say that didn't happen. Not all of them, though, because the The American ambassador to Russia, to the Soviet Union at the time, Jack Matlock, has said publicly and has written that undertaking was actually given. So at least in Gorbachev's mind, the undertaking was given, and of course it was only a matter of a couple of years when the Soviet Union fell and the Baltic states were in NATO. So clearly, from Russia's perspective, the West, and in particular the US, is a problem. The EU is also a problem, but the EU is a problem in a different way. Part of the issue for the Russians in the EU is that, by and large, the major members of the EU have allowed Russia policy to be, let's say, unduly influenced by Poland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. Now, those four countries have legitimate concerns about Russia given their past. But by allowing these countries to actually, in a sense, shape EU policy, those countries like Germany and France, which traditionally, well, from the 70s anyway, have been much more amenable to the Russian position, haven't been able to have the same sort of impact on policy. So yeah, basically, I think you're right. Just one other thing to say, and that is that a lot of people say that the taking of Crimea was the first forcible change in borders of the Second World War settlement. That's wrong. That's wrong. The first change was done by NATO and the Americans when they extracted Kosovo from Serbia in the 1990s. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't have done it, but again, this is how things are framed that's important.
Okay, Peter?
Yeah, a couple of questions for Graeme. I'd like him to expand what he had to say, which was penetrating and very right, except at one point. He seemed to think that the New York Times actually has high standards. The New York Times doesn't have high standards. It gave us the Iraq War and a whole lot else. It's to be assumed that if bad things are going to happen, the New York Times will not perceive it correctly. Of course, the larger issue hanging over us all is the nuclear danger here, which hasn't actually even been mentioned, but this is really the top danger. This is the difference between 1914 and 1939. We are facing a potential diplomatic slide into war in which nuclear weapons are ready to be used on both sides. Putin has made that clear. My specific question would be, do you go along with Putin's own stated view that his conventional forces are actually inadequate and therefore he needs to be ready to use tactical nuclear weapons in particular quickly if Russia is confronted or faced with any kind of hint of military defeat? So is Putin likely to be happy, quick on the nuclear trigger? Just as a side note here, if we get Trump as president, I think we have to abolish any idea that the American finger is light on the trigger. And the second question would be, I have to admit I was ignorant of this current state of the Ukrainian government. But obviously the danger in that is that Putin will feel that he's almost justified in moving on Kiev from whatever positions he's determined to defend and support in Donbass.
Thank you, Peter. Perspicacious as ever. On the nuclear issue, look, I think if you look at Putin's record in international relations, he's shown as being reckless, but I'm not sure he has been reckless. I mean, I think he's taken chances where he thought those chances had a pretty good show of coming off, and therefore, I would be surprised if he resorted to nuclear weapons to begin with. I mean, if there was conflict that broke out and the Russians were hard up against it, then I suspect he would, because I think he's pretty ruthless. But I wouldn't have thought that he would do it sort of at the first drop of conflict, if you like. But you know, I could be wrong. I've been wrong before, as you've pointed out sometimes. On the Ukraine and the possibility that Putin will take it over, I don't see that as being at all likely, because I'm not sure what he would gain by it. What would he gain? He would gain a country whose economy is shot. That will take an awful lot of cash to fix up, which Russia doesn't have. If he was to take over Ukraine, there is no border, there is no buffer between him and NATO. It's much better for him, I think, and for Russia, given the perspective they take, it's much better to have a weak government in Kiev with a reasonably strong pro-Russian minority in the east of the country. Because that will then gain for them the buffer I talked about. It may ensure that a pro-Russian, or at least not an anti-Russian, government comes to power. The danger, I think, in Moscow's perspective, is that the government in Kiev does fall, and it's taken over by, let's just say, an anti-Russian government, and there are plenty of people around in Kiev who are anti-Russian. If you got a really strongly anti-Russian government in power in Kiev, what would then happen, I think, is a real, it's a real new ball game. But this is where the West would need to be much more sensible, I think, and much more sensitive about the situation than they have been up until now. But I can't see that there's a great deal to gain by taking over Ukraine, or even by taking over the eastern part of the country. Crimea is different, but I think that there's nothing to be gained by that.
Yeah, I believe Putin's Russia has saved Syria becoming a jihadi wonderland like Libya. I'm just wondering what your thoughts on who the true sponsors of terrorism are. Since Russia's invasion or airstrikes, it's exposed that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, US, Qatar sponsors and arms of ISIS. What are your thoughts of that? And as well, with the Ukraine invasion, it's became known that Senator Newland phone was tapped, and the US spent $5 billion in the overthrow of Ukraine with neo-Nazis and what are your thoughts on that? Have you heard anything to that regard?
Oh, look, I mean, I can't understand the Middle East. I don't know how anyone understands the Middle East. I mean, it's pretty clear, I think, that ISIS, on the one hand, the sort of moderate rebels or the anti-Assad group, and Assad are the three major actors within Syria itself. The problem with the American and the Allies' involvement in Syria is that, as in Iraq, they don't have any real idea about what's going to replace Assad if they throw him over. They say that these moderate rebels are going to form a government. Well, you don't need to be Einstein to understand that the so-called moderate rebels consist of a significant number of independent groups. Now, who's going to bring them together and sort it through and get a government out of them? Nobody, because nobody is going to be able to do it. Putin at least has a plan. Now, you may not like the plan. The plan is he's accepted that Assad will have to go, not immediately, but he'll have to go. But he wants him to go in a sort of a regularised fashion so that somebody can replace him, because he doesn't want Syria to become like Iraq was, like Libya was, like the danger is that Afghanistan will become. So as I say, at least he has a plan, and he's trying to implement that plan. On Ukraine, yeah, look, it's clear that the Americans were supportive of the measures to overthrow Yanukovych. We have that on direct. You know, we have the verbatim admissions of that by Newland, by the ambassador Jeffrey Piat, who's still there, and you only have to look at what people like John McCain and these sort of people were doing at the time. What's revealing is that if you look at what people like Piat, the ambassador, are saying, and Joe Biden, the American Vice President, who is the main carrier of American policy in Ukraine, he goes there quite frequently. They're talking about the need for economic reform. But when they talk about the need for economic reform, what Piat is talking about is that what we need to do is to improve the investment climate. Now, you know, you have people who are struggling to find enough to eat. You have an economy which is almost in free fall, and we're talking about improving the investment climate.
Sounds like imperialism.
Or what Joe Biden is talking about is that we need to ensure that the natural resources extraction industry gets itself together. Now, why is he saying that? Maybe that his son's involved in the natural resources extraction industry in Ukraine, but we wouldn't want to make that line, would we? Wouldn't want to draw that comparison. The point is that the Americans have been involved in what was going on in Ukraine, and it's blown up in their face. But they won't admit it, and they can't admit it, at least in part because of the domestic consequences of that. And the problem is that there doesn't appear to be anywhere for them to go in this.
Well, I guess, I mean, maybe a couple words on the situation in Syria. I think it's easy to have a plan to sort of counter, a bit of counterpoint to Graeme's argument. It's easy to have a plan when you have free rein to pursue, you know, what you see as the national interest, and you operate from this perspective of, you know, sort of 19th century style great power, sphere of influence politics, and you want to keep Assad in power because he's your guy. But the situation that the U.S. faces is, I mean, Graeme captured quite well, that there is no good policy that you can easily think of. You know, the only viable argument that I've seen in the U.S. side is, you know, full-scale invasion. You know, clearly the opposition forces that are palatable for the U.S. to support are just too weak, and the U.S., you know, and among other things, reading the New York Times, it's been very clear that the U.S. has poured a huge amount of money into training and trying to support these moderate rebels. Moderate meaning that they're not terrorists or jihad extremists. They don't do beheadings. They don't want to, in the end, come back and overthrow the United States. There are just a handful of those groups who oppose Assad. Yeah. And it's, you know, how are you going to create a viable, that's not an option. And so it's quite a conundrum if you have to deal with domestic politics and you have to deal with all these other issues, and you have the other sides in the conflict like Turkey, who, I mean, just like the US and others, is thinking about their domestic politics. And for Turkey, the main issue is the Kurds, for the, you know, not very palatable government in Turkey at the moment. for Syria and Russia, the main issue is anyone fighting Assad, which sometimes is ISIS and is her front, but sometimes is the ones the U.S. sponsor. And it's an easy choice for Russia. Well, the U.S. is going to fight ISIS because, you know, it's a clear issue in U.S. domestic politics that you can't not fight ISIS. So why not focus your firepower on the groups the U.S. is trying to support, or other groups that are opposed to Assad? It's you know, quite an efficient solution for Russia. I guess the only thing I would say is it's a much easier policy problem, foreign policy problem, and it's easy to have a goal when you're in the situation of pursuing the kind of goals that Putin would pursue and not constrained by domestic politics or your other allies the way the U.S. is.
Do you think it's deliberate that Russia has continuously bombed Syria and therefore create such a vast number of refugees into Europe? You know, and what is Europe going to do about this continuous flow? You hear Greece can't cope with it. All the Eastern Europe has closed their borders. Now, if this continue, Russia is very happy sitting there laughing at the Europeans. What do you think is a solution?
Yeah, I think it was a deliberate act by the Turks. Why they did it, I have absolutely no idea. But again, I mean, what we have here is a show of Russian restraint, essentially. I mean, that's one of the next questions. Is Russia bombing Syria in order to create refugees? This is part of the narrative that's now beginning to come out. That really the European refugee problem is caused by Russia. Now, you know, I think this is a bit bizarre, actually. I would have thought that the refugees were coming out before the Russians began bombing, and that it was a real response to the awful situation that the people exist in. Now, the Russian bombing has made that worse, clearly, but I don't think that the Russian intention was to create a refugee wave that is going to engulf Europe. How is Europe going to respond to it? I have no idea. I have no answer to that, and I don't know whether anyone has an answer. Relationship between Russia and China. Clearly, they have tried to cosy up over the last 2 years or so, at least in part through this organisation of the BRICS, through the establishment of a new sort of equivalent of the World Bank, but in sort of competition with it. And they clearly do have interests that come together. But they also have interests that drive them apart. And I think that any long-term relationship between Russia and China will be rocky, simply because the relations that they have, the interests that they have, are not all compatible. What's the incompatibility? Well, there is an issue about Eastern Siberia, and about whether the territory there should remain part of Russia, should become part of China. There is an incompatibility in terms of the supply of resources. The Chinese want resources, want oil, gas, this sort of thing. The Russians want to sell oil and gas at the highest price possible. South Korea and Japan can probably willing to pay as high a price as China, and maybe more reliable as a partner. I mean, there are technical things like that. They are also in competition for influence in Central Asia. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, these sorts of places. There's a clear sort of great game going on, but it's not the traditional great game. But there's a struggle for influence between Russia and China there, and it's clearly evident if you look at Kazakhstan, which has traditionally been much closer to Russia, but has received a lot of economic benefits from China, where the Chinese are clearly trying to draw them in.
I'll be very, very quick. Just three quick points. So on Russia and China, sort of, I think what Graeme has said is right. On Russia and China, I see the big issue is China. China and Russia are not able to form any sort of serious cooperative arrangement as cooperative great powers balancing the U.S. Primarily, in my view, because Russia is just not China's market, and the Russian economy is not strong and won't be strong, and Putin has made disastrous decisions in not diversifying the Russian economy when it was doing well, and so China, I think, which is a great thing, is inexorably tied to Japan, Europe, U.S., and the rest of the world, and simply doesn't need Russia and can't cooperate with Russia if it interferes with those relationships too much. And I actually think that's quite a good thing and a complicating factor in all these security confrontations. With Turkey and Russia, I think Turkey, I don't exactly know what's meant by deliberate versus accidentally or, shooting down the Russian fighter plane, but it was certainly, a very small incursion into Turkish airspace that could have been let go. But the fact that Russia is fighting on the side of Assad, Turkey's bitter enemy, it's just very clear Turkey is going to risk its huge economic relationship with Russia and the important ties and other strategic interests it has, because this is so important to Turkey. So on those two relationships, I think it's pretty clear that states are acting in their own interests and security and economic interests.
I might be slightly off the point of the evening, as the conversation seemed to be very geopolitical, but I guess my question is, don't we have a problem with civil rights in Russia? I feel that they're Putin obviously is a very clever politician and he has a lot of support, but for a lot of the minorities in Russia that suffer, whether it be Chechens or gay Russians or Crimean Tatars or whatever it is, there's a lot of oppression, and I personally think that a lot of the uprisings in Ukraine were about the rule of law and what people had expected to come, and being disappointed with corruption and whatnot, even if it still remains. And yeah, I guess that's just my question.
I'm not sure what the question is, but I would agree with, certainly Russia, I think Graeme wouldn't argue, Russia's not a democratic society that guarantees rule of law and the rights of minorities, et cetera. And this is a huge issue, and I guess one thing that is, for me, a very interesting aspect of Russian governance and the governance of non-democratic regimes in general is when they're fragile and when they're stable. And so I don't pretend to know the answer, but in many societies, including Ukraine, they're fragile because of the level of corruption. And people are so angry. If you go to China, you think China's this monolith with very strong governance. People are so angry, and they have been for so many years, about basic corruption that they encounter every day. And in non-democratic regimes, it's hard to know. Sure, Putin wins elections, but you wouldn't call them free and fair. When you control the major outlets of the mass media, it's very hard to know what people really think, even if there are, fairly good polls that are done in Russia and other places. So I think this is really an unknown in Ukraine as well. Ukraine is very dysfunctional. I've also read about that a lot in the New York Times. but yeah. But I think these basic aspects of democratic governance, I think, is sort of, in a sense, a hopeful sign, because people actually care about this even in states where democratic governance is not the norm and has never or rarely been.
Look, Russia is clearly not a democratic society. Very few people would argue that. Is there oppression against minorities and in the society? Clearly there is. a whole range of minorities. I mean, you mentioned basically ethnic minorities. There are problems for ethnic minorities. There are problems for LGBTI people. This whole civil rights infrastructure is incredibly weak. I mean, it's actually quite interesting because the chair of the Committee of Human Rights in Russia, who is a person who is really well thought of, has just left that position and become the head of the Electoral Commission. Now, it's pretty, there's an election coming up. We don't really know what that means. But your general point is accurate. I mean, clearly there is problems within Russian society for a whole range of minority groups, and they don't look like being solved in the near future. It's not a democracy. Elections aren't free and fair. Well, they're free, but they're not fair. They're not. Well, that's easily answered. They're not fair because the people who could possibly pose a major threat tend not to be able to get onto the ballot because their registration is refused. They're not fair because the media gives overwhelming attention to the ruling party and to Putin rather than to the opponents. They are not fair because there is ballot box stuffing that goes on. I can go on. I mean, it is clear that they're not fair. The only people who say that they are fair, in terms of the international observers, are those essentially from Belarus or from Central Asia.
First question is regarding the price of oil dropping the last 6 to 12 months. How has that actually impacted the Russian economy in terms of their reserves and the ability to sort of get out of their economic crisis? And leading from that, regarding from a Russian perspective, even though, the second speaker was referring to how the West hasn't been able to acknowledge their mistakes, as things start to get worse in the EU and in America, are the Russians viewing that as a form of payback, or is that viewed as a form of it's coming back to roost?
Yeah, I didn't quite understand the second question, but the first question, the price of oil has, I think, in this sense, U.S. foreign policy and what it's intended to achieve has been very lucky. And I think the sanctions that were imposed were not costless, but fairly easy for the U.S. to implement. The real sort of, if you think the sanctions imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea and actions in eastern Ukraine were a good idea, the real hero of that is Germany, which has led the effort in the EU and made big economic sacrifices at a time when EU economy is obviously not at its peak. But even those sanctions that are imposed were of somewhat limited pressure, but the drop in the price of oil has been something that's really caused serious damage to the Russian economy. They've spent a lot of their reserves defending the ruble and trying to keep the economy afloat. And I think it's, if the alternative is great power war or larger scale conflict, I think these kinds of tools of great powers sorting out their differences are much preferable. It's not an ideal world, but I think sending a signal through these kinds of tools is much preferable. And I think Russia has responded and will respond, not in a way that's not it doesn't involve compromise on both sides. But I think the sanctions have caused enough pain where it's induced restraint. And Putin's policy, I believe, among the Russian foreign policy elite is seen as not very successful overall in his relations with Ukraine in particular, because of the effectiveness of these economic pressures.
Yeah, I think there are two things to keep in mind here. One is the drop in the oil price, and the drop in the oil price has been catastrophic for them. Because by and large, as Ben said, Putin has not introduced economic reform, so that they've been relying upon high oil and gas prices to sustain the economy. and therefore the drop in those prices has caused major problems for them. The sanctions, I mean, the sanctions clearly have bit, and they've had an effect. There is currently a debate going on in Russia about whether what the sanctions have done has been to cause a revival of Russian industry and Russian production. At the moment, there's no sort of clear evidence of that, but some people are arguing that that's happening. Were that to actually take hold and, in a sense, to transform the economy almost from the bottom up, you might say that the sanctions have actually been a blessing for them, because one of the problems for Russia has clearly been that because they haven't undertaken economic reform, they're so heavily dependent upon the oil and gas prices. So I think Ben's right that American policy here was lucky. It's interesting that the Russians have been talking to the Saudis and others about production levels and this sort of thing to try and get it up to a more sustainable level.
You've been an excellent audience. The questions have been great, and I think the questions have reflected the standard that Ben and Graeme have reached, far beyond anything achieved by the New York Times, according to Peter. And I'm sure we're going to invite Ben and Graeme back. Ben, you'll be invited back to talk about Hitchcock films. And Graeme, I suspect, it's a kind of hypothetical. It's going to be about whether Putin met certain standards in caring for Graeme's cat. So, look, thank you both, and thank you for a very impressive evening. Thank you.